Right, I'm delighted to be joined today by Mickey Pelletier, who is the founder of CWM Strategies. Really appreciate you taking the time to join me, Mickey. We've got some great stuff to talk about today. How are you doing?
Johnny, I'm doing good. Thanks so much for having me. It's exciting to talk to you. This is as we get into the topic here, this is one I'm passionate about. So I'm happy to kind of be able to talk that through with you and share some thoughts.
Yeah, exactly. And this kind of came about through an article that you put out a while ago, which really, some of the points in it really resonated with me. I thought it was a great article, really asking some interesting questions. So we're going to be addressing the topics of the adoption of services procurement or statement of work programs within broader contingent workforce programs, and looking at the approaches that are currently being taken by MSPs, how clients are receiving that in the market, and how these services are kind of being delivered, and really what the opportunities are within this market as a whole. So that does kind of tie into some of the great points you raised in that article. But before we get started, do you want to just give a bit of context on your experience in the industry, your background, what you're doing now with CWM Strategies, just to put a bit of context around where that expertise and where your thought process has come from?
Yeah, thanks. I think that's helpful, kind of where I'm coming from. So I've spent about 17 years in the contingent workforce industry. Started out with Allegis, one of the leading MSPs, and worked with them, on the operations side, managing MSP programs, and then moved into implementation. Spent a couple of years at SAP, was back on the MSP side over at Kelly, implementing solutions and standing up solutions there. Both your regular staff aug MSP, and then SoW services was starting to come into play as well. Went over to Accenture and consulted on contingent workforce solutions there, doing anything from standing up VMS technology to helping companies standardize either supplier rate cards, to helping them think through organizational strategy and governance of their contingent workforce program. Then went on to the buyer side, was over at Zillow and ran their contingent workforce program. And then most recently was over at Meta as the head of contingent workforce strategy there. Unfortunately, part of the layoffs there that took place at the start of the year. And so after being in the industry for so long, decided to go out on my own. And so I had started CWM Strategies, really with the focus on bridging leading practices with future innovations in contingent workforce. So there's a lot of great things that MSPs, VMS do, but then there's also things that people don't like. Then there's leading innovations such as direct sourcing, talent pooling, FMS, freelance management. What if we could cherry pick the best of what the MSP, VMS are doing in contingent workforce management and start tying that in with those future innovations? So I think there's a lot that could be done really to improve contingent workforce programs, whether that's ran by an MSP or a self-managed program. There's really just a lot to elevate contingent workforce programs, and that's really what I'm here to do, to help companies do that. So I have experience really on all sides of the VMS, the MSP, large consulting firm, buyer side as well. So really those four corners kind of have given me the background to be where I am today.
Yeah, it's really interesting. So I want to come on to in a second just what you saw by crossing that divide. But when you talk about contingent workforce programs and the kind of scope for innovation and improvement and changes, it's quite amazing, really, because it's a pretty well established setup and a service. And even like the big VMS have been around for 20 years plus in the market, and so it's quite a well established model. But as you say, when you start bringing in things like more use of direct sourcing, the whole freelancer management piece, the growth of the gig economy, that changes things. Plus technology and process and approach has to move with the times. Throw in COVID, changing market conditions, different approaches to worker status, all this sort of stuff. There's a lot going on, so the industry can't afford to stand still. And I've heard a lot of kind of commentators talking about how it can sometimes be a bit stagnant when it comes to innovation in the industry. But also, I think when you look at how contingent workforce programs can expand to look at broader workforce channels, so for example, statement of work, services procurement, ultimately it's all about problem solving around how organizations are getting work done. They've got different work delivery channels. It could be done in a variety of different ways. It's likely to be a question of horses for courses. Best to do this piece of work via a gig marketplace. Best to do this work over here with the permanent staff. This is best for contractors. This is ideal for freelancers. And this outsourced piece of work is statement of work or services procurement. So there's a logic to it, but there's also quite a big difference to it. So I think that's an area as well, which obviously, as we're going to cover, there's a lot of potential innovation, partly because that side of the market is less mature. It's more embryonic.
Yeah, would agree. It's fascinating. The contingent workforce space changes very quickly, but at the same time, it doesn't. We get very stuck in our ways of doing things and thinking that maybe the way that we're doing it is the best way, where there are opportunities to improve and change. I think we see that a lot in the in contingent workforce management, some of the MSPs. It's possible that there isn't innovation. You're just doing the same old thing, and your statement of work spend goes unchecked, and there's not really a control around it, because at the end of the day, the goal you should be going for in contingent workforce management is that visibility. I shouldn't say it's the one goal. It's one of the many goals, but one of the things I see is that visibility of who's doing what, where, when, why, at what cost, across all of your workforce. I mean, that includes your FTEs. There's the mythical total talent management that people talk about. And what does that mean? Well, that's visibility into all of your workforce, any headcount, including your FTEs, including your freelancers, including your statement of work, your staff aug workers. Who are they? What are they doing? Who are they? What are they costing? And being able to tie that into holistic headcount planning. And we talk about that, and companies talk about that, but there's very few companies that are really doing that well. And it's a beast of a task. When you talk about these companies that have hundreds of thousands of workers, then you tie in a body of contingent workers that are not their employees. Boy, that can get a little bit tricky and taxing. Then how do you tie that all together? And what about this thing called co-employment and these big fear-mongering things that get tied into the industry? It can be quite overwhelming for clients, and then challenging for the MSPs, the VMS, the providers to solve all that. Because while there's a standard way of approaching these things, each client has their own unique approach and thought of how they acquire talent and how they utilize talent, and how one company visualizes that statement of work, body of work, and how that's done may be quite different than another company's. So I think that's one of the exciting things, is there's a variance in how things are done and how things are thought of, but then there's a bit of an overarching standardization that the players in the game have tried to create. So I guess back to my original point, where every day things are changing, but they're not. And so it's really a matter of each company, what do you want to do, and what is your prioritization? I honestly get on my soapbox way too often of that clients and their leadership don't change, and they don't do the right thing for contingent workforce management. I'm very passionate about that. Contingent workforce programs are not set up for success. They're not enabled to do the right things. They're not invested in to properly manage their statement of work population, to set up a freelance management system, to honestly think about what's the best way for us to get the talent that we need to get the work done. And let's tie in some cost savings and a bit of compliance as well, to make sure that we're thinking about this holistically. So before I go down too many meandering topics here, you could tie me back in, Johnny, as go down a couple tangents, because this is something I could go on and on about. But let's we'll focus here.
Look, there's so much to talk about. I mean, already you're bringing up stuff. I'm scribbling down notes here as you talk, because it takes me back. You mentioned Allegis. I had a really interesting conversation with Bruce Morton, who's the global head of strategy for Allegis, AGS. Great guy, and just some really interesting concepts we were talking about around work versus worker, kind of capability and capacity versus talent, and how organizations view this. I think there's a strong cultural element, as you say, to the differences that exist within different organizations as to how they like to get things done. But the bottom line is the C-suite need to understand what is the total capacity and capability of our organization, and what is the most effective way for us as an organization to do the work that we need to do to deliver our products or services to our customers. So I think that capability and capacity side of it, which almost runs in parallel to kind of like the total talent management conversation, although total talent management conversation has been around for longer and probably promised far too much and not delivered that very much in so far. But it's really interesting when you look at it, and I tend to look at it from a it's just ways of the organization getting work done ultimately. But it's really interesting with the fact you bring up about it being viewed differently in different organizations. Different organizations will have a totally different attitude to whether they really value contractors or freelancers, or whether they're willing to approach things like the gig economy, or how they view services procurement and statement of work. Do they view it adjacent to contingent workforce, or do you end up with completely different stakeholders, procurement over here and contingent workforce, or HR talent over there? So there's loads of stuff we can get into. But so let's just go back to something that you brought up when you were talking about your background, which is where you've basically crossed the divide. So your experience spans some great MSP providers, some great names on the direct side where you're working within organizations running these programs, and also the consulting element to it and the technology element to it. So you've kind of seen it from, as you say, 4 pillars or all the different angles. What are the kind of main lessons that you learned from that? And what did you see as the benefits of having seen all the different sides of it?
Yeah, I think going from the MSP and VMS side onto consulting and being a buyer and sitting in the driver's seat of being a program owner or strategy owner, knowing how the MSP operates, how the VMS operates, just I think made the process smoother for me. I knew what their methodology was. I knew what they were going to do and what they were going to be able to bring to the table. So I was able to challenge that and ask them for more. Because I knew, additionally how their bottom line worked and how they were incentivized to grow their programs and how their financial, planning and structure worked, of how they monetize the services they're offering. So, I also knew the back office services that they offered, and so could ask for more things and say, hey, I know you guys offer, this type of supplier rationale. Can you help me with that? Because there's a lot of great things MSPs and VMS do. I just wrote an article about if you want to bring your MSP in-house and do a self-managed program, the things you need to consider. But while I'm talking about moving away from the MSP, I also give a lot of thumbs up to them saying, hey, there's a lot of great things that your MSP offers. You just need to be able to ask for that, because the back office support and the expertise that they have is great. So I think knowing all that, aside from that one tangent, I was able to anticipate more what they could offer and what they were going to be able to bring to the table, challenge them when I disagreed with them, but then also was able to move with their methodology, which is usually pretty solid coming to the table as well.
And that obviously it puts you in a great position to be able to advise in terms of what you're doing now, because you've been there and seen it, you understand it from the different sides. Because it would be wrong for there to be bias where one side is just saying, well, it's the fault of the MSP, or it's the fault of the VMS, or it's the fault of the end client, or whatever it may be, or it's the strategy. It all has to come together and it all has to be driving towards the same objective. But that is possible, and there are some great programs out there.
Yeah. It's funny, not to interject, but you talk about the faults. I mean, I've written too about this, that a lot of struggles that companies have, it's not necessarily their MSP. It's often buyers can't get out of their own way to do the right thing. And yeah, sometimes the MSP drops the ball, or it's not the right partner. And maybe they are the right partner. It's just not the right people from the operating team on that MSP operating the program. And so maybe the stars don't align there. But people want to throw the MSP under the bus a lot. But I mean, I think some of the time, even majority of the time, it's the buyer that can't make the decision, that can't get the right stakeholder buy-in, and they can't enable themselves to do the right thing. So it's hard as a partner to elevate your clients, when they're maybe not ready, to get out of their own way to do the right thing. But I think that's an important thing to call out there is, and as we get into the statement of work conversation, that's a big component, is just the readiness and the capability and the capacity client side, buyers, stakeholders, people that are interested in statement of work to get out of their own way and be able to do the right thing to enable the appropriate change.
Yeah, totally. And it's interesting when you look at that, when you look at statement of work, which some people don't like the term, should be referring to it as services procurement. If you talk to pure procurement people, they'll say, well, what is services procurement? I've got I've got different categories of procurement, which services flows across a lot of them, some simple, some complex. So ultimately what we're talking about is engagements where organizations are getting a service delivered under a statement of work engagement. I'll pay you X to deliver Y, outcomes, outputs, deliverables, milestones. That's the central factor that we're dealing with here. But some organizations would consider either all of it or a portion of it as being quite closely linked to their contingent workforce approach. Whereas in other organizations, you might get a small portion that is considered kind of in a gray area between, broader procurement, IT services procurement, or legal or marketing procurement, etc., and that contingent workforce slice. So it's really interesting for me to see how the MSPs are trying to navigate that space, because one of the problems and one of the hurdles, and ultimately this is all about hurdles because it's a very nascent part of the industry so far, is one of the hurdles is actually just the recognition of the problem and the definition of the problem, who owns the problem, and that kind of sophistication and maturity within the clients to be able to accept the help that they need. So my question to you is, do you think that most organizations have a problem with SOW spend? Would you say that's fairly common?
Oh, easily. Yeah. Without a doubt, with the SOW spend, I think you can go a lot of different ways with that. I think, and you started to allude to this here, but definition, what falls under statement of work, services, procurement. To me, at the end of the day, anything that has headcount tied to it, whether that's coming through the staff aug directly from a staffing agency, or 1,000-person outsourced call center through a statement of work, there's still headcount tied to that. You have people accessing systems, you have people accessing buildings, you have people doing work for you on your behalf. All that needs to be tracked and managed. It's about that visibility, that who, what, where, when, why, what cost. I'll probably say that 6 more times during this call, but that definition, companies struggle to do that, and then to be able to bring together HR, talent acquisition, procurement, legal, and IT to all say, yes, this is services procurement, and hey, here's the process we're going to follow for that. I think companies have a problem with definition, and then getting the stakeholders all on board to be able to move forward with a synchronized process to go through the stages of acquiring and onboarding statement of work, services, procurement talent.
Yeah, and it's very interesting because one of the things I see sometimes that I don't necessarily agree with is where there's kind of like a copy and paste in terms of process approach from a contingent worker program to an SOW program. I mean, even things like, the fact that some of it is going to be time-based within some statements of work. There are going to be days of consulting. It might be an installation where there is a service engineers delivering installation as part of a project that a supplier is outsourced to a supplier to deliver the outputs. There's still an element of people's work within that. I guess the kind of maturity curve is where organizations start moving away from, what's the name of that person, how many hours have they done, to it flows up to the supplier level, where it's looking at, okay, within that supplier, who's engaged within that supplier, we need to be able to clarify who they are for security and access purposes. But actually, it's not about an individual person's timesheets. It's about service delivery, possibly on number of days or number of days of a particular type of qualification or category of service provider person. But it's not about the individual. It's about the service provider delivering that service.
Yep.
So it kind of flows up the chain. And yes, there is, there's a huge conversation around misclassification. And that is something where MSPs can really apply that expertise to clear up the edges, demark the different zones and make sure that companies are operating in a more compliant manner so that they can utilize contingent workforce effectively when they need to, and they can utilize statement of work engagements effectively where that is the best route. So I think there's been a lot of progress around that sort of stuff with the way that triage works, the way that organizations are looking at misclassification. But like you say, it also comes down to the maturity of the customers as to how they break out and understand the way that they're getting work done already.
Yeah, and I think that's when I say definition, I should build on that a little bit more. And you were just starting to touch on that. What is staff aug work versus SOW work? Because one of the big problems is that there is a fair amount of work being done that is truly, contractor staff aug, temporary agency, whatever you want to call it. That's more hourly based. It unfortunately gets bundled underneath the statement of work side at a terrible markup, and work that should be done, maybe on the agency side by a temporary contractor, is being done under statement of work because the company has good trust in this vendor partner. And so there's a lot of cost savings that's missed out on and misclassification. Because I think too, it also comes down to the treatment of the work. With statement of work, worker services procurement, typically you're pretty hands off with those workers. You say, hey, go build this widget, go implement this solution. Where with your staff aug workers, you're more hands on, you're more in the trenches with them. Typically, for those listening, this is, it's not a black and white case. There's, typical themes that go along with this. But on the statement of work side, there's less hand holding. There's maybe touch bases of, hey, what's going on? But there's no day-to-day management of the workers. Maybe there's interaction with the account owner or the project lead, but typically fairly hands-off. And then whether it's time and materials, yeah, you can have some time and material workers under statement of work, but majority of that work is deliverable based, output based. There's a guarantee, there's a warranty with it that, hey, you were going to build widget X kind of sucks, you need to fix it, and we're not paying more until you do it. Okay, that's the guarantee under SOW, where if you're doing that under staff aug, it's an hourly thing. It's not necessarily output based. It's you worked 40 hours, we're paying you for 40 hours, whether the widget was built or not. That was, and that may be why you go the services procurement route, because you're looking for ultimately, some sort of milestone output deliverable. And I think that's where companies get caught up a lot, particularly when you look at offshore services. A lot of companies love to use offshore services, whether that's in Eastern Europe or in APAC. There's some cost savings that can be done there. But unfortunately, what I see in a fair amount of companies is that in the IT space, we're going to go to these workers, the service provider in Ukraine, and we will have them work on our IT team under a statement of work, but they're in the trenches every day being managed by the FTEs, and they're working side by side with these FTEs and these workers under the statement of worker. That's starting to blur the lines of temporary services, employment, and statement of work. And so when you finally find that out under an MSP or statement of work program, you start looking at things and you realize, boy, that these workers under the statement of work, they've been here for 5, 7, 8 years, and they're doing the same work as an FTE, and they're just outsourced to another country. When you go in and tell that company, no, you shouldn't be doing that, and here's the reasons why, they don't like that, because these people they've been working for us for a long time. They're under the statement of work, and they do good work. They don't like being challenged because that shakes up the way that they've been doing this, the way they've been getting work done. So I think that's when we talk about definition and maturity model, that ability to shift away from that behavior of, yeah, you could have these people under a statement of work, but you can't be managing them hands-on like you are every day, treating them like an employee, including them in meetings that maybe have nothing to do with the actual project work that you're doing. I think that's where companies get into a little bit of hot water. And some of the companies I've worked for in the past, most cases that they get into where legal needs to get involved, majority of the time it is under the services procurement statement of work, and that's a good example of what often gets escalated when those types of cases get found out. And I'm cautious. I'm no legal expert, and I'm not going to sit here and tell you XYZ means you are out of compliance or you are a staff aug worker or a statement of work worker. But there are themes and, I don't say standardizations, but typical behaviors and treatments that help define these workers. That depending on company and how they utilize those, you can help define that work. And I think that lack of definition can get companies into a little bit of hot water, where they've had these people under a statement of work that are really should be agency workers based on how they're being treated. But they're not. So that's a long-winded way of saying, again, definition can really drive it could just drive issues with compliance and what really constitutes statement of work.
Yeah, and yeah, I always the demarcation for me is it's work, not worker. And ultimately, if you're paying for a person's time as a contractor or a temporary worker, if you're paying a supplying company for an outcome or an output, that's a
Yep.
services contract. They take liability. There's responsibility. You're managing them. They're just solving the problem for you. They're delivering the solution. But I think when you break it down in that context, do you know what? I think MSPs end up, the first things they're faced with on the services procurement side are probably the messiest possible scenarios, because they're the scenarios that sit in that grey area. And as I was alluding to before, when you look at organizations and look at services procurement in the broader context, how many contingent workforce programs that talk about getting involved with statement of work, look after the full IT services category? Probably very few. It's where you get this kind of SoW that the organizations have termed as like a problem area of, smaller consultancies or individual consultants and that sort of work that kind of blends into that contingent workforce side of thing. So the MSP is kind of getting a bit of a baptism of fire by probably being led into those more difficult, harder to define grey area scenarios. But I think you're absolutely right. There's some basic steps that can be put around that to push compliance, and that, as a technology service provider in that area, the way that we approach statement of work is very much from a services procurement first point of view, which automatically takes people down the steps of, if you're going to put a statement of work together, it needs to look, smell, sound, and taste like a statement of work. And so that is one way which an MSP program enabling technology can move that sort of thing forward. But the potential opportunity for MSP providers in the broader services procurement context is so massive, because organizations, I asked the question, do you think people have an SOW problem? The answer clearly yes. I know from our outreach into the market, dealing with chief procurement officers at massive organizations all around the world, pretty much every organization has a problem with how they buy and manage services, because they are difficult to define, they're difficult to manage. There's something that's grown really rapidly outside of the kind of technology and service provider ecosystem, where contingent workforce has been well catered for and is pretty much a solved problem to a large extent. And the procurement of goods and materials is a solved problem to a large extent. But the growth of services and the complexity of what you're buying and how it's delivered has massively outpaced the way that services being provided by intermediaries, and the way that technology handles it has been to a certain extent left behind. So I think if MSPs can really cross the divide and actually build their credibility as providing their services in services procurement and statement of work alongside the contingent workforce side, they can add a massive amount of value to organizations, because there's huge savings to be made. And they can add a massive amount of value to their own organizations in terms of the opportunity to make revenue from it, whilst providing a huge cost saving and ROI benefit to their customers. So it's an interesting space. And that's where I was going to ask you kind of like, what size do you think the problem is? But I mean, within the typical thing like I can't remember SIA or spend matters, it's kind of like 4 times the size of the contingent workforce value is the typical.
Easily, yeah. How big is the problem? For individual clients, some individual clients into the billions easily.
Yeah.
Yeah, because I think when you talk about being able to you service that from the MSP side, you talked about this earlier, but trying to apply, hey, here's how we handle contingent worker contractors. Let's apply that to the services procurement side. And I mean, there's similar processes in a sense where you have a need, you fill a requisition, you put it on a work order, you pay and things like that. At a small level, yeah, it's the same, but the complexity around the statement of work, you can't have the same people managing those services. You need procurement specialists, category management people that know how that side of the business works, from contract negotiation to statement of work creation to managing that supplier relationship. I mean, you could have one supplier manager on one supplier because that one supplier has 15 different SOWs with 1,000 total workers underneath it. There's firms out there that's very common, and each SOW has its own unique body and of work for different business units within this greater organization. That's pretty complex. And how do you tie that together? It's likely all under one master service agreement, 15 statements of work underneath it. Each statement of work has X amount of workers, and a fair amount of those statements of work statement of work workers are like swapped in and out all the time because they're either not needed at that phase of the work, or there's just churn and turnover, things like that. Think of call centers. There's new heads in and out every week. So being able to track that, in a sophisticated technology can certainly be a lot to do. And so you have the procurement side, and then you have that headcount side of, hey, we have this churn of workers going in and out. We need visibility to that. Okay, how are we going to handle that? How are we going to handle the layering, that overlayer of the procurement of the greater statement of work management, and getting it to a spot where it is more just headcount tracking and milestone management, right? So there's sort of phases within the life cycle of a statement of work that can require either a different specialist to handle at different times, or more of a jack of all trades that knows the life cycle very well and can hop in regardless of where that statement of work is, to be able to provide the service either to the manager, to the supplier, to ensure that the process is staying fit to what it should be, and that they're getting the visibility, and that payments getting made, and that milestones are being completed on a timely basis. Then you tie that in with the project manager or the delivery lead, from either the client side or the supplier side, and you got this whole other layer of management within it that isn't typically done in a VMS or any technology. How are we know that Mickey and Johnny are doing this SOW. Great. We know they're tied to these milestones. Great. But then on the supplier side, they have their whole other way of managing their resources and tracking things internally, and there becomes just additional layers. So the complexity just grows and grows with each persona within the process that you look at. So having somebody to manage that, going back to my original point, can require lots of different skill sets and capabilities just to handle various parts of that life cycle. And I think that leads into the complexity and why this has lagged behind it, and getting the buy-in, not the buy-in, but maybe the buy-in is the right word, and the use case. The use case is there, but that's a lot to do and a lot to think about.
Yeah, I mean, you'll talk to some procurement people and they'll say MSPs that deal with contingent workforce shouldn't be anywhere near our services procurement because their expertise is in staffing. There's a point to that, but you're seeing more and more of the kind of like well-respected, large, some of the medium-sized MSPs bringing in specific expertise, teams who understand the procurement side, the services procurement side of it. But when you actually break it down, it is quite a similar problem-solving exercise. Staffing companies are really good at solving problems. When you look at contingent workforce programs, they're really good at creating a process, ensuring compliance, and managing spend effectively. So you need to be able to create a requirement, just like you need to be able to create a job spec. You need to be able to match with the right suppliers, engage them contractually, and ensure that you're actually getting the right delivery. tracking heads and things like that. I think the more you go down the kind of really fully blown services procurement route, the less that is important in terms of a mindset of how many workers is that taking. But clearly, it's still extremely important in terms of onboarding, offboarding, system access, building access, and potentially looking at price breakdowns through that lens as well. But there is a crossover of kind of type of process problem solving scenario, but that expertise is required. And as I say, we're seeing much more of that in the industry now, but it's a bit of a chicken and egg scenario, because the more it's kind of just tacked on to a contingent workforce program as something super basic that's just headcount tracking, the less you kind of need those specialist people, and it doesn't foster that growth. But also the less that expertise exists within MSPs, and the less willing they are to invest in that, then the less likelihood is that their clients are going to take them onto deeper involvement in services procurement for various reasons. One of which, because it's a massive area of spend, it's critical service delivery, critical to their capacity and capability of their business. But also you're dealing with more sensitive information, actual project level information, whereas within a contingent workforce program, it's job specs. So it's quite different. But it's fascinating to see how that's developing. But it does feel like it's not going as far and fast as it could do.
So there's two things you said that I sort of want to pick on there. The first was around your procurement may not, certain areas of an organization may care about different parts of the SOW life cycle. Procurement may not care so much about the headcount and the visibility into the workforce, where HR and legal might. They really care, and they want to know, they want to have that visibility, but they may not care about the statement of work and the spend that's being calculated. And so it's interesting because various parts of an organization care about various parts of that statement of work life cycle. And so that's why, the people that are running the program, whether that's an internally run program or a MSP running it, it requires, like I said, either a jack of all trades or very sophisticated people to handle various parts of that service on behalf of a company. And procurement likely doesn't want to give up some of that work. They don't want to hand it off to the MSP. Either A, that trust isn't there, B, they want the control of doing it themselves. So if an MSP is going to do it, they really need to come in with the right level of expertise, depending on where in that SOW life cycle it is, because different people care about different parts of it, and all of it's important at the end of the day in the whole scope, and each part is important to various pieces of the organization. The second piece you talked about, just like headcount tracking, and I think there's a bit of a maturity curve that goes on with your statement of work and services procurement management. Typically when the MSP comes on, they say, hey, let's do headcount tracking. You have these 30,000 services, quote unquote, services procurement workers. Let's just get them going through headcount tracking. There's no finances tied to it. We know that we have Mickey and Johnny tied to supplier X, and they're here from September 7th until January 23rd. And it starts there, and that becomes sort of a front door way to get people on board and through the tool, but it gives no visibility. Oftentimes programs get stuck there with the goal of that being a front door of, hey, now we have this visibility, now we can start moving them into the services procurement module. That's a great goal, but I've seen that just get stuck for years and years, it's just stuck in headcount tracking. So that maturity model takes a long time to take off. And how do you get past just that headcount tracking model? And oftentimes that's where you start to have pilot programs, and maybe one supplier or one country or even one statement of work starts to go through the services procurement module. And that's how that maturity model starts to take off. But the headcount tracking is interesting because that often, like I says, the front door, the gateway that MSPs will use as a way of just getting just the lightest little grasp on the headcount that goes under the services procurement side. So I just wanted to dissect that a little bit because I think that's an interesting piece that I've seen on lots of different clients, lots of different projects.
So when you look at programs that get stuck in that worker tracking at that worker tracking step. Why do you think that is? What do you think are the main reasons for it, for the programs kind of stopping there a lot of the time?
Yeah, I think it's several things. And this is some of the stuff I wrote about in the article. I mean, I think from the client side, there's that investment to take the invest the money, the resources, the time into being able to stand up a statement of work module and being able to not just collect that Mickey and Johnny are under supplier X for ABC dates, but okay, what's the statement of work that they're tied to, the milestones, the financials, the SLAs, the KPIs, the deliverables, everything else? How do we get that into a system? And wait, Mickey and Johnny have swapped in and out on that SOW 2 or 3 times. That's a lot of work and requires a large effort to do that. I think there's resistance as well from the supplier side. Some of the big companies, they don't want to go work with an MSP or work under an MSP. They love their direct relationship with the managers that they have. That's one of their gateways into new business, is because they buddy up with the from the manager to the supplier. And that's great. Relationship based work is okay until it's just status quo and you're paying for a name versus actual dependable work. But I digress. And I think as well, that supplier adoption is a big piece. The visibility to cost becomes a lot more. That visibility is there, and so suddenly wow, I'm paying $350 an hour for a worker that is doing the equivalent work of $150 an hour project manager I have coming through one of my staffing agencies. So suppliers don't want to give up that visibility. And I think just the size and complexity, I alluded to that earlier, with the investment and the resources and everything that ties in a statement of work. Man, that's a lot. That time that you need to take requires an army of people from all facets of the organization, and that's a huge commitment. So unless you have this buy-in from a leadership standpoint, from the C-suite down, that says, no, we're going to do this, we're going to invest the time, money, resources for it, it's really difficult to do that. And then I think overall, just that general resistance to change. Look, we've done it this way, it's okay. We like the way things are done, and maybe we don't need all this, and they just don't see the value. That resistance, I think, stems from that overwhelming feeling of the work that needs to be done, and maybe there's a prioritization of money elsewhere, that we don't need to do this right now. And I think it just keeps getting put off, and then you go and have to lay off a fair amount of the company. The timing's never right, and that resistance to change just continues to perpetuate as an overarching theme to all of these other reasons why adoption and change becomes difficult, with getting services procurement management brought on in an efficient and productive way.
Yeah, great points. Ultimately, there are hurdles. I'm very much in agreement with what you're saying as to why it happens. It's just too hard a lot of the time. It's just too difficult. You talked about the size of the investment, the time, money, people involved within the end organization, within the MSP, the complexity of dealing with services procurement anyway. It is complicated by its very nature. There'll be concerns as to whether the MSP has the expertise. The MSP will still probably be maybe learning in some cases, but the client hasn't got the capability to deal with it themselves. They need to outsource it. But
nobody's ready for it. Yeah.
But I think this all plays into the existing setup, and that does include existing technologies, because if you've either got technologies that are not mature enough in this area, where they've just got an SOW bolt-on, a very basic bolt-on, that's not going to cut it, and that's very quickly realized by organizations and MSPs. And then if you look at the big players, then you're dealing with a big bang, a big hurdle type situation. So I think the market has to change, in the sense that the hurdles need to be lowered. There are ways to do that. We've got some really cool stuff we're doing around that, but I think that's the essential thing, because if you can't get started, you can't improve delivery. You can't build that capacity within the MSPs. You can't build the trust. You can't get throughput of, we've got new clients. We might be working with them on a small basis, but you talked about that kind of like, small gains and small entry point. I think if you look at the existing infrastructure that exists right now, it's very difficult to do that. And that's something that certainly I am passionate about advocating for change around that, because, the proof is in the pudding. Deliver the service, show the value, show that you can do it, lower the risk for the customer from a cost point of view, from just the weight of getting the project over the line. How many people need to be involved, how much resource is required at the MSP. And unfortunately, what happens is, exactly as you said, both the MSP and the client just revert to type, where the MSP just says, I'm just going to concentrate on contingent, and the client just says, it's too complicated, too scary, I'm not going to look at that. And it just gets left and left and left. But, it can't go on like that forever, because if you look at the total spend globally across all services, it's something like somewhere between 10 and 20 trillion. So it's just so gigantic, it cannot be left. And like you say, the inefficiencies and the money left on the table, and the stuff that people aren't seeing, where they've got these maybe big organizations that are working under a statement of work but are just churning it, and they're not getting value, or where there's just no bidding involved, there's no competitive process, and that's just standard across the organization, because procurement teams are lean, they haven't got the capacity to just look at it all manually, systems aren't effective for managing it. So you end up in this situation where it's kind of like, as long as everybody's hitting budget, the budgets are okay, that's fine, but nobody knows what they're getting for their money, and nobody knows whether they're actually getting any value. So I feel like it has to change.
There's just layer upon layer of reason not to do. I mean, one other that I didn't cite is, we already have technology that does that. We already have a procurement system. We already have a system that tracks all our suppliers. We already have a contract system. Yeah, you have 3, 4, 5 different systems for one project. For one process. That's a lot of churn. That's a lot of swivel chair, and I doubt those are all integrated together. Maybe some of them in some organizations, but it just becomes another reason to not change. And that's, like I said, the soapbox I get on is, you got to prioritize this. You could do anything you want, but you can't do everything you want. And this is a commitment organizations have to make. If you want that visibility, if you want that cost savings, there's so many reasons why you should, but we focus on a lot of reasons why the status quo is okay and why it's not a priority. How can you effectively know what your organization needs from a work demand standpoint if you don't have visibility into what you're doing? And if statement of work, services procurement, all of that type of work is supporting, a quarter to half to maybe 3/4 of your company, man, you really should know what those people are doing. Why do you want headcount planning? Because as you accrue data from your statement of work, you can more effectively know, hey, we've done this in the past. It turns out it did take 100 people to do this, or you know what? It actually only took 30 and it wasn't as bad. And we could actually cut that project size in half. That visibility, it's more than just compliance and doing the right thing. It's being able to plan effectively. And you can't plan effectively without data. Data takes time to accrue. Data has to go through a system that allows you to aggregate it in a digestible way to give you proper reporting and analytics, so that you can, 2 years from now, know what you did and be able to build on that momentum and be able to challenge when a supplier says, this is going to cost $1 million. Well, is it? Because I think we got the same thing done for $500,000 a year ago. And I think it gives you a better footing, as you go into negotiation, as you have this data accrued of what things were like in the past. But that's an enormous amount of change, and it comes down to a commitment to wanting to do the right thing and make the change that's going to enable predictive analytics. You can't have that without the visibility and the data being within a system. So it's just another soapbox moment there of, man, just make the change. That the capabilities there, teams are ready for this. There's great technology, there's great providers, there's great people, consultants that can come in and do this and help you do it in-house. It's just a matter of, what do you want to do and what's the priority? And the priority for the past year. We've seen 2023 has been the year of layoffs, particularly in the tech space. When you look at some of the data overall, there wasn't like that many layoffs, but from the tech side, that was all you saw. That was all you saw on LinkedIn. All you saw in the news was this layoff and that layoff, and all that cost savings. What if you were achieving that through other means instead of laying people off? Not that it's flip of a switch and turn on SOW and bam, nine-digit savings right there. It doesn't work that way, but it takes time. It's a long game in all of this, and I think that's, I don't know if it's my generation or people just want things now. We want things yesterday, and maybe that's business in general. But wanting to work on a project for a year to a year and a half just to get data 2 years from now to save you money, it's hard to see that. Everybody wants that ROI immediately. So there's patience involved here, and I don't know if everybody has that in the business world. The older I get, the more I think, boy, it's not that complex, but to some people it is.
Yeah, I think, like kind of as I alluded to before, I think the industry to a certain extent needs to get out of its own way.
Yep.
You have to invest in this. Clients have to invest in the concept of saving money in this area. MSPs have to invest in bringing in expertise, being able to solve the problem, understanding the technology landscape as to what's the most effective solution to bring to their customers. But the whole thing needs to be, the whole process needs to come out of this logjam situation where everything's just too big and too complicated to move, too expensive to move. It needs to break that down and get moving, because that's how the solutions will evolve, in my opinion, by doing it, by increasing that capability and experience within the MSP. Different clients having different requirements, building that trust within their customers, building the experience of dealing with different customers. We had the experience of starting off in kind of like public sector, doing a lot of stuff in public sector. And that meant that we were working through frameworks. So working through a framework with a vendor neutral framework owner, you are dealing with so many different requirements on the other end of it, because you've got multiple clients coming in through that framework with completely different requirements, completely different sizes and types of clients. As I say, in public, it could be across any area of public sector. Could be like a council for a small area, or it could be a major, central government department. It doesn't really matter. So when you're dealing with that environment, one of the things it taught us was how to deal with the complexity and variation that you get across statement of work engagements. The great thing about it is, when it comes down to it, the process of procuring, contracting, and delivering a statement of work is always underlying. It's always the same. You need configurability to manage that complexity, and you need to be flexible around the different types of projects, how some projects are going to be much more weighted towards time of expertise being provided. Some are going to be KPI based, some are going to be pure deliverables. A milestone might be a sprint in an agile process, but ultimately it still follows that same underlying step-by-step life cycle. So there are ways to bring things into that can expand this out. And as you said, that one of the questions I was going to ask you was around how can you get companies to prioritize it? How can you get them to see the value of it? You answered that with a lot of the points you just raised. You brought up quite a few of the reasons why, around having the data, making these kind of predictive buying decisions in the future, the amount of money involved in it. But ultimately, I think the best way to convince them is to actually show them in kind of like, palatable bite-sized chunks, rather than trying to eat the whole elephant at once. But one of the other areas around that is looking at the misconceptions around the cost and the value of a statement of work versus hiring contractors, for example. So in my opinion, one isn't better than the other. They're just for different purposes and different scenarios. One will be more suitable than the other.
Two different types of work. Yep.
Two different types of way of workforce channel. It's just you're getting the work done two different ways. Now, some companies will take the approach of being very much on the side of the fence of we don't like outsourcing it. We don't want a price for delivery. That looks expensive. That's going to add X%. Okay, they're taking some liability, but we could deliver that cheaper through contractors. Well, maybe you could, maybe you couldn't. If it's the right type of requirement for contractors to deliver most effectively, then yes. But if it isn't, then you could have contractors that are sitting there going to deliver it who just take forever and it's never delivered. So that mentality around output and outcome-based delivery is something that, especially when people are looking at cost savings and cost transparency, is incredibly important, because you can't be working on the never with a group of people that are working away. But maybe in that situation, you can cap a cost around it. You can understand and validate and rationalize that cost, and then you hold your suppliers' feet to the fire to deliver it. It's their problem to deliver it at that point. So sometimes there can be misconceptions around things like that, that, as you said, it comes back to the point you made about visibility. You know, you're spending all this money. If you don't know what's happening, who's working on which projects, what people are coming in and out of your organization, there are all kinds of risk around financials, the IT security risks, massive amounts of potential problems that can be created if that's not managed effectively. So adding into the kind of cost saving financial incentives, there is that risk element, which also ties into what you said about misclassification.
Yeah, I think the all of that is there, and I think trying to formulate my words here. I'm not stalling.
Sorry, I went on a complete soapbox rant there as well.
What did you actually say there, Johnny? No, I think all of that becomes, when you think about the reasons behind, doing this and what it takes. I think we said early on, demonstrating in small pieces, that those quick wins of, hey, look what we did for this statement of work and what we were able to do. We generated 50K in cost savings. That's a drop of bucket in the grand scheme of things. But, expand that to other statements of work, other lines of business, you can get some wins, and the visibility that you had, et cetera, that there's a lot of good things there. I think the other piece that I think is lacking, I think, with contingent workforce as an industry as a whole, and that's including, contractors, services, procurement, FMS. I think we've broken through at like the manager and the director level. A lot of those types of folks get it. Where it's really lacking, the buy-in and is the visibility and the understanding of the industry as a whole, is at that VP, that president, that C-suite level. They just don't get it to the point where they're able to say, you know what, we should focus on this. And while people want to have, companies want to break through to be able to sell to the C-suite, they don't understand it. They don't understand the contingent workforce industry. And I think that slows things down, because you need that buy-in. If you're going to move 40,000 workers that are under across 2,000 statements of work into one system and have this big program manage it, that's such a shift that requires C-suite buy-in. That requires your chief procurement, chief HR to say, this is the way, guys, this is what we're going to do, and understand it and be able to champion that. I think that's difficult when directors get it and they try to sell it to their C-suite and they're able to get 30 minutes with them, every other month. That's not enough time for them to consume and really understand that. And I think that prohibits companies being able to break through and being able to get that buy-in from the C-suite. And I don't know the answer. I think if I knew the answer, I'd have a different model and how I approach this. But I think that's where, as an industry, we're lacking, is that the C-suite doesn't get it. They are the drivers, the mandators of change. Not that this needs to be a mandate, but they're the ones that can ultimately sign off. And when things start to go awry, say, guys, we got to get this done. This is the priority, and be able to back it up. So my soapbox compounded with your soapbox, just a couple things building on what you said that I think can be part of the difficulty and the part of the things that need to change to better enable this level of change, because it's I don't know, it's hard to put words to how big all this is. Trillions of dollars.
well, that's the thing. That's the point I was driving at, where I was kind of posing the question. The problems you're discussing around this having to be a C-suite level discussion, it having to be a massive amount of spend involved, massive programs to deliver it, all based on the business case. We think this is going to work. You know, do you see that as part of the hindrance that stops people moving forward at the moment?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah. That's a high level of change, high level of stakeholder that you need involved to help not necessarily drive the change, but be at the forefront of championing that. Yeah, absolutely. And I think as we talked about it earlier, each line of business has their own sort of reason for either wanting or resisting this. And to get everybody on the same page does require leadership to sort of beat that drum and say, look, listen to that. That's the beat we're moving to going forward. Either you're on the boat or you're not, right? So yeah, that's a huge component of it, with so many various entities within a company involved within statement of work. You need somebody to step up and, like I said, make that call.
So what do you think the MSPs could do to try and mitigate that side of the problem? Do you see ways that they could try and work around that?
Yeah, I mean, if I had the answer, like I said, I'd probably making more money, right? Like how do you break through to the C-suite level? I hate that so much of the business is relationship driven, and who matters, but unfortunately it matters, and that's the way of the world, not just our industry, things as a whole. So it takes time. And I don't know, I think if it's just a shift in business as a whole for leadership to be able to think of work differently. Work isn't just your FTE employees that you need to be in our office 5 days a week, and that's just the way the world works since forever, and that's how it needs to be. Work's different now. Work could be part-time, fractional. It can be done by contractors. It can be done completely outsourced, and you need to know how that works. It sounds silly to some, and I've shared this idea, but the idea of chief contingent workforce officer. Contingent workforce needs to be one of the pillars of a company. How could you have 50+% of your entire workforce is non-employees? Why do you have director level people running this? That should be a little bit higher in the organization. To me, it comes down to the idea of having this chief officer who's tied in with all the other leadership that drives all this. And maybe it's not the chief contingent workforce officer, but it's somebody that is at a leadership level that can more easily influence, persuade, and educate their peers on why this is important, why there needs to be a focus, and being able to challenge the status quo and drive the change. It's an idea I've been toying with, and I know I'm not alone. There's likely others that have had that idea as well. And maybe it's silly, but I think that's a part that could help drive change, is having embedded leadership from a contingent workforce perspective with other leadership in a company. How do you do that? I don't know. And your original question, I completely avoided it. How do MSPs do that? I don't know. They start advocating for that. And it becomes an industry movement. More people, I write articles about that. And I think that's a really effective way, or excuse me, I think this is a really effective way of driving change, is getting the word out, getting the education, and shifting the way we think of work as a whole. And there's so many great organizations that are doing that. But if it's going to be at the C-suite level, I think we need some contingent workforce, C-suite embedded people in there to be able to drive that level of change. And I doubt myself sometimes when I say that. Is that the right thing, or will people laugh at that? Maybe, but I don't know. It's what I think is right. If people want to take this more seriously and they want to have change. I mean, I've heard of chief freelance officer was a term I heard about a year ago of companies as this freelance movement's coming up. Well, why isn't there a chief contingent workforce officer? When I think contingent workforce as all non-employee talent, statement of work, freelance, contractor. That's my overarching term. And don't get me started on the standardization of terms in the industry, but that's to me, one of the key pieces that needs to change our way of thinking of work and our way of thinking of the usage of contingent workforce in that greater landscape of work.
Yeah, and I've heard people talk about that kind of strategic workforce planning or strategic capacity planning or capability planning existing at the very top level in the C-suite, because who owns the entire capacity of this organization to do work, to build our products or to deliver our services?
Right.
Who's coordinating that? Ultimately, it's distributed within various areas at the moment. And I think, if you're going to go for that big bang approach, which is what the industry feels tied to, that both from the client point of view, from the technology point of view, and from the MSP providers point of view, then you've got to somehow penetrate those very, very highest levels to get that buy-in. It's going to take time. That's where you get these big handful of RFPs that come around each year that are worth billions in services procurement spend, but there's not very many of them, and they take a long time to turn around, and there's very, very high risk. So quite often they're very basic. So the organizations that are delivering that service, the MSPs, are not being able to learn quickly enough, not being able to prove the delivery of their service quickly enough. So, I mean, would you see it being an alternative approach for them to be able to do smaller, faster, cheaper, less risky things on a more regular basis alongside this approach of going for the very top level?
Yeah, I mean, I think a multi-prong approach can be the right way to go, because it's a multi-prong change that you're trying to make. Yeah, I think we talked about before, being able to chunk things out into smaller bite-sized bits is certainly a way to go. Otherwise, the change is just far too overwhelming. And I think being able to break things down, as an overarching statement, yeah, break it down, make it more simple, right? But can you really do that? It's difficult when there's organizations I've been a part of, and they outsource an entire body of change of multiple systems, to one company. And then within that, that one overarching statement of work, there's all these, sub statements, sub articles that break down the additional work. And then that becomes really complex. And so is it more digestible to just have individual statements of work for just various bodies of work? Well, when that's tied to a greater organizational transformation, that's hard, because you want to have it all tidied and buttoned up into this one sort of throat to choke in terms of documentation and maybe account leadership. I want to say I don't know. I think it's hard. I think that's an approach to go, and it's going to vary by what you're trying to accomplish and by organization and what is right. And each organization has to do what's right for them. But if you're creating more work for yourself just to get work accomplished, maybe you need to question the path you're going down.
Yeah, I guess the point I was driving at is that if you've got hurdles around complexity, so say, for example, like a giant program of work, like an IT transformation, like you're talking about, that will have underlying statements of work within that broader program, that's very complex. It's high risk. It's worth a lot of money. It's a big thing to move. But if you wind back from that complexity to look at areas where there will be smaller statements of work, discrete packages of work, that could be managed, that's kind of like a problem that's there waiting to be solved. So that's the complexity size of it. Then you've got the size of it. If you wind back the size, both within the projects that the client is looking at and within what the MSP are looking at in terms of what size team do we have to put on this? Is it just one person that we can use from another team to show them how this works, or is it a full program team? So that's when you wind back the size. And then the other thing is the time. If this is going to take, a 6 month, 2 year rollout with everything involved, can we wind that back? I mean, I'm having conversations at the moment where I'm kind of really trying to pose those questions, and they're not easy questions to solve, and they do require a bit of cultural change. I think it requires cultural change inside some of the MSPs as well, and I think they might be surprised at the approach that clients take to this when they have those hurdles lowered slightly. But it'd be interesting to see how that kind of pans out. I could be right or could be wrong, but I feel like there's a path forward there potentially, alongside the stuff that's already happening with the very large programs, which is clearly going to continue.
Yeah, no, and like I said, having your pilot case, I think is the right way to go. And you need to start with more manageable work and get the wins out of that, the quick wins. Because the big bang rollout, I don't think is right to go. And I think it's a very iterative process. Okay, hey, we're going to take 6 months or 3 months to implement it for just maybe one statement of work. And we're going to turn on the tech. We're going to turn on the managing body, whether that's in-house or outsourced to an MSP. And then we're going to let it sit for a couple months and see how it works. And it's either going to work great, it's going to work okay, and we're going to need to learn for it, or it's going to suck and we're going to shut it down. And you go from there. And then I think you build on that momentum of what's going well, and you expand that to something comparable in size, or maybe a little bit larger. Yeah, because to take on the $1 billion project, that's you need to have some really strong use cases and wins and all sorts of benefits already there to be able to justify we're going to do this. So yeah, maybe cut that if I answered your original question wrong, but I think that that's the right way to go when you think of this, the grand scheme of, hey, we need a statement of work program to be stood up. You starting small and building momentum just has to be the way to go, because you don't know what you don't know. And I think too, once you build that foundation of, hey, we have the tech set up, we're pretty good. What was a 3-month implementation actually is only going to take a month, and it's more change management for this next focus. And then it's 2 months because now we're doing a $250 million spend, because it's pretty large. Let's see how that goes. And yeah, it's the momentum and just iteratively learning what works and what doesn't, and then you go into another country and suddenly the rules of the road are a little bit different, because the way you engage within Europe and certain countries in there, I'm not going to pick on any, versus what's done in South America versus what's done in Canada and North America. The variances are there. So you have to start small.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I think in terms of justifying the case within organizations, and developing this side of the business, it's there for the taking. Because if you look at it from a client's point of view, they would love to outsource this problem. They would love to have somebody solve this problem for them effectively. They just need to trust that, for example, contingent workforce MSPs are the right intermediaries to be able to have the expertise and bring the right tech and the right process and solve this for them in the right way and make it manageable without, at the moment, it being too much of a high risk. Because you kind of look at it and go, well, why would a company outsource the problem in the first place? Sorry, I've just got sounds like a Spitfire or something flying over. I'm next to I'm near a classic Goodwood airfield. We get lots of Spitfires.
I hear nothing, so hopefully the listener doesn't as well. So
it's always
fly on.
It's always a good sound. But what I was going to say is, why would companies outsource it? It's really difficult for them to sort it out internally. You think about the lean procurement teams that you're dealing with. They've got existing process, all of the change management involved. If they outsource that, it packages it up much more effectively in a bubble outside the organization. There are some real benefits to doing that. And there are also benefits from a tech adoption point of view as well. When you look at, when you mention, some clients will say, oh, we've got Ariba, we've got Coupa, we've got SAP file, we've got Oracle, whatever, Workday, this, that, and the other, that might touch on parts of the process. We've got this contract lifecycle management system, we've got this procure to pay, source to pay. That in itself creates massive hurdles, where the internal teams within that, the IT teams are looking at it going, oh, well, can't we do this or shouldn't we do that? Whereas when you outsource it, if the technology meets the requirements of that outsourced provision, with an intermediary taking in the problem and providing back a solution and interfacing in the right ways, purchase order, finance system, whatever it might be, that's much more palatable for the end organization. But again, if you take that hurdle back as well in terms of cost and time and complexity, they can get started and they can realize that and go, that bubble, that solution bubble you have over there is doing a great job. Let's put more through it. We can see the evidence now. Let's build up that business case. And that's when the C-suite start to get involved. And if they're saving enough money, you know what, even their kind of the golf course relationships with the big consulting firms might seem less important to them when they think, you know, everyone should have a fair go at this in terms of the full supply chain, big suppliers, small suppliers, bring in more diverse suppliers, bring in greater diversity of suppliers. All those things can be considered when there's the visibility and the proof in that value can be delivered. So I do think, yeah, that's where I see the reason.
I think you bring up a good point there. And we talked about this a little bit when there's that resistance to change. We already have these systems, but that tech stack, hey, we're going from these 5 somewhat integrated swivel chair systems down to 1, maybe 2, depending on where it is in its maturity life cycle. I think that goes a long way, because to me, it's all about the client end user experience. How quickly can I engage Johnny and Mickey to come in and just rock this project for me, right? How easy? How many clicks do I need to do? What sort of hurdles do I need to go through? Wow, it's only in one system and it's all integrated. That's pretty nice. I don't have to wait for it to kick from this over to contracting, over to legal to review, over to this other provisioning system. You know, all of that that user experience, I think, can deter, you know, the lay stakeholder, you know, the engagement manager that's trying to do this. And when you get enough of that negative feedback on a process, you know, I think it can create another hurdle or resistance of change. You know, but it can also be the enabler as well when the manager says, wow, going through 5 systems sucks. And the manager that went through the pilot of the new statement of work system, well, yeah, we did it in, you know, 1, maybe 2 systems. I think that's always a compelling case and compelling story that can go a long way. And like you said, when the C-suite gets a hold of that and the end users are happy, then there was some cost savings involved and legal's happy because we have compliance and visibility. You start getting these champions on board. And then, like you said, suddenly those bigger projects, yeah, it's more to tackle, but there's some energy behind it because that ROI has been seen. So I think you did a real nice job of summarizing that in a way of that, you know, just taking it to the next level and getting that snowball effect of momentum and I guess ROI, you eventually bubbling up.
You know what? I think momentum is probably the key word here. You know, you've mentioned that a couple of times. I think that is nail on the head, because you know, you need that start point, but it needs to get moving. And we're talking about such big amounts of spend and such high levels of complexity. Momentum is absolutely critical to it. If you look at the market as a whole and where it's going now, I mean, you and I are talking about the art of the possible and where this stuff can go. And there's plenty of people that are working really hard within MSPs and within client organizations to make these things work and to make these things happen, and within the tech providers to do that as well. What do you think, or do you see any kind of key changes that need to change within that contingent workforce solution stroke MSP stroke VMS ecosystem? Do you see any key things that you think need to change within that ecosystem space to take the whole SOW opportunity forward?
I mean, from the provider space, I think it starts with a tech stack, right? A reasonable one that meets the capability or the capacity of what a client has, ultimately meets their needs from a capacity and capability standpoint. Excuse my phrasing there. And being able to demonstrate that, you know, holistically to a client, and that's like, okay, great. Now, who's going to operate and manage that? And I think if the MSP is going to do that, or any type of provider, being able to easily demonstrate that capability and that capacity of that tech stack, whether it is an actual tech stack or it's just one system all in one, depending on what it is. And that's, I mean, it's not like that's not going on. Companies come in all the time. They provide the tech demo. The MSP says, oh, we can do, you know, X, Y, Z. I think one thing that could change that it takes time, though, is doing more thoughtful and thorough analysis prior to you actually beginning to implement and knowing what, like integrations often can hold things back because you know what, hey, our technology as a provider needs to there needs to be some build and development. It turns out the client side does too. Well, knowing that before you go into an actual implementation, I think can save you time later, because when you keep on having to kick that down the road because you don't have integration requirements and you don't know how long the build's going to take, almost doing a pre-implementation before implementation. It's actually an article I'm working on right now. Is, yeah, it's extra time, extra cost, money, but what it saves you later can be a big difference, particularly when you're trying to, dive into something more complex as statement of work. Even with the best rigor, methodology, and whatnot, there needs to be some additional, I think, forethought to it, to better set up the implementation for success. So I think being able to navigate that water before the water gets too choppy, I think can save you time and money later. Some companies do that better than others. It's like, hey, we signed the contract on Monday, bam, kick off on Tuesday. Well, boy, how could you do that? That there's just a lot of pre-work I think needs to go in, that because you're a lot of the money that a VMS or an MSP makes isn't always made from implementation. They don't get money until the tech is turned on and the MSP's live. So it's, speed to revenue, baby. Keep it going, even if it's sucky. We'll figure it out later. MVP, minimum viable product. It's like, I don't like minimum viable product. I want things to work right the first time around, and I want things to be done. And sometimes it can't be done that way, and that's tough. But it comes down to planning. I think we need to give more time for planning. Providers hate me for saying that because it's speed to revenue, and I get that, but speed to revenue is not very good when you need to spend more time and money later trying to fix the problems that you swept under the rug earlier because you're just trying to flip the switch. So I don't know, that's a key component I think needs to change, is just more pre-planning and forethought into what are you doing, particularly with those more complex pieces of an already complex project.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you there. One of the things you said I thought was really interesting, talking about this, speed to revenue and the problems with that. And I sometimes feel like, let me pose the question to you. Do you think when you look at a statement of work or services procurement program next to a established third generation contingent workforce program, do you think that having them priced in exactly the same way makes sense, in the sense that if your MSP contingent workforce program has been driven down to the lowest common denominator in cost, it's a super mature program, driving extra savings out of it is really hard, and it's at a really low percentage. I see a lot of instances where the SOW programs are just tucked under the same agreement with the same kind of percentages applied to them. But in terms of the value delivery, surely it's got to be completely different when that's absolutely greenfield on the SOW side. Do you think there's potential for that to change in the way that the charging model evolves?
Yeah, I don't think that it's just a one-to-one relationship and you just tuck it under and we'll just slap the MSP fee onto it. Value-based work is one methodology of charging and getting paid for the work that you do. And I think when it comes to the implementation of a technology or an MSP service, that it's not, I said it earlier, it's not just this one-to-one relationship and you can't just tuck it under the same thing. I think it does require different ways of cost modeling. And I think that requires some time to sit down with your client and explain, hey, here's what you're actually going to be getting out of it. Here's what we're going to charge you for that. And here's why it's different from this. Here's what you're getting out of it. Here's the cost savings from that. You could charge from a cost savings. I always joke it, just charge whatever a percentage of what you save. We're going to save you $5 million and we're going to take X percentage of whatever money we save you, and here's the tangible way behind it. I don't know if that's a realistic way, but I think there are, more tangible ways to pricing it versus we're 2.05%, whatever you spend, whatever goes through it, that's what we're taking off the top. Because depending on the value you're getting, Gen 1 versus Gen 3, I think that pricing model should vary. Yeah, I would agree with that.
Yeah, and again, if you're able to start small, implement cheaply, do it simply without giant requirements on the MSP side, again, if you've got to say, look, there are some costs involved in us doing this, that makes it easy for the customer. Or one of the things that I think we will start seeing is more like MSP proprietary solutions around statement of work, where they can actually roll it out super quickly. So and in that way, you're maybe even cutting out upfront costs for the client and allowing it to move really quickly, but in a very simple approach to start with, which again kind of lowers those barriers. And I think, what's your opinion on the potential for MSPs to kind of provide more of a proprietary service that's maybe a bit more standardized, maybe a bit more kind of like low level but standardized? Do you see a place for that type of approach in the market?
Yeah, almost like more of an entry level thing, just to sort of get things going on the statement of work side.
Yeah, just in terms.
Yeah, I certainly. Go ahead.
Where effectively the MSP is mapping out a process and saying, we've got X amount of evidence that this process works. We'll provide you this value. Our intake will be around these statements of work and these suppliers. We'll bring you these outputs, and the value will be X. It's easy to get started. But we're explaining to you this is what it'll be. It's kind of easier to sell than going, there's a whole world out there, we could do everything, and it's giant thing. Whereas it's like kind of
yeah. I mean, when you try to customize a solution, that's great. But clients don't know what they want, and you often have to come as a provider with a consultative approach. Like, look, this is what we recommend and what we think is the best, based on XYZ evidence. I think every program is unique, but I think there are standardized ways of doing things. And if the a client wants highly customized, great. With that comes time, cost, resources, etc. If you could have a standardized solution, that's great. There are things that just to consider. Are you going net new? Are you only bringing in new workers? Because if so, wow, that's a lot faster to flip that switch, where if you're trying to migrate 10, 20, 30,000 statement of work workers into the system, you can't do that very quickly. That takes a lot of time. Additionally, what type of system integrations are you going to have? If you're going to integrate there's a fair amount of requirements that need to go on, because each interface that a client utilizes with their own backend systems may vary in how that's configured and what version, platform, et cetera, that they're on. So I think that can delay it. And then, so between that and so the net new workers versus bringing on the current all of the workers, and then integrations, and then custom fields, custom configuration. I think all of that can draw it out. So I think there's a potential for that, and the client needs to make that choice of which route they want to go. But I think there is a world for that, and a space for the more of an out of the box solution, depending on what the client's looking for. Yeah,
and I think going back to what you said earlier about demos, I think that's where that side of it really comes to the fore. If an MSP organization has a packaged solution that they can offer, and they can just go in there and demo it, a picture paints 1,000 words. If you can show something to somebody, log on, show them how it works, show them how your MSP service will knit around the way that the system and process work, that's very powerful in breaking down those barriers. It's a kind of light bulb moment for the customer, where they can potentially just see how that takes away the problem. And in that case, the simpler the better. And like you said, with things like integrations, if you're looking at that sort of approach, you'd have to have that integration level as being very simple at that point. But you can always expand that out. You can do things simply. If you look at how much manual stuff most companies are doing internally, the mind boggles. If you look at how much manual stuff MSPs are doing, in a lot of cases, even then, that's quite surprising. So actually, if you've got a simple automated process that maybe, doesn't have loads of integrations to start with, it's still going to be a significant improvement on the current process in most places.
Yeah, no, and I think that's, the swivel chair approach can work. I think technologies have evolved to a point where some of those integrations can be done more simply with the right forethought and planning. But I think going back to the original question, the ability here for the MSP to do that, more out of the box, just more simplistic solution. I think it also requires more on the client to have the wherewithal within a leader to be able to shut things down, because you start getting into a room of 20 stakeholders and suddenly, can you integrate Kronos in? We want to bring Clarity, our project management system, in, and hey, can we get this type of reporting, this, that, this, and suddenly the requirement list grows from 5 to 500 within an hour-long demo because everybody wants their own thing. So yeah, you can do out of the box, but the client better know very well that this is how it's going to be, and no, we're not customizing a whole lot. Maybe a field here and there, to meet needs, but a lot of this is going to be standardized right out of the box. And we're not here to listen to you about your needs and requirements. So I should say that sounds very, very, very crude, but we're not going to be able to flip all the switches to turn on those requirements now. And this will be a long haul. This is to get you through the door right now. So I think there's potential for that if you have the right buyer and the right buyer mindset and leadership on board to support that out of the box approach.
Yeah. Like you say, it's kind of, it's not necessarily we're not going to do what you want, but it's like, this is where we would advise you to start. And this is how we believe we can deliver value for you with this. And this is how it would work. We've already thought it through. We've already created the process. But I think,
and I think too, when the client comes in and says, we want XYZ, great. If you want to shift, then here's what this does. This turns us in from a 2-month implementation into 11-month, whatever it's going to be. And not that they'd be able to on the spot say, oh, you want this? Okay, that's going to drag the timeline out. So you can do anything you want. You can't do everything. What's it going to be, and be able to make those decisions. But I think that ability to consult from the provider side goes a long way, because the client doesn't necessarily know what they want. They see the shiny bells and whistles and say, oh yeah, do that for us. That's what we want. They don't know that. They don't know necessarily what they want for certain. So I think it requires a dance on both sides to be able to get that right.
Yeah, the devil's in the detail. There's always some complexity involved, but if you're aiming for simplicity at the outset, then you're going to do a lot better than, as we discussed, kind of aiming for a big bang, eat the whole elephant approach to start with. But the stakeholder leadership within the customer, you're absolutely 100% right, and not allowing it to get pulled into some committee and pulled out of shape and pulled into a giant thing. It almost needs to be like under the radar to a certain extent with this type of approach. but when I talk to MSPs, one of the things that I find interesting is the frustration that they have where they're trying to sell SoW solutions to maybe even really large organizations. And there'll be some stakeholders within that organization that are putting their hand up and saying, please help me. I've got a serious problem with this. But because the whole thing then expands out to be too large, it never happens. But those stakeholders, if there's a way to work with those stakeholders to start with, do you feel like that's an opportunity? Because I mean, have you seen enough people that would jump at the chance to do that?
Yeah, I think it's funny because one thing I write about law is always having a governance committee. People from HRTA, procurement, legal, IT. That's your governance committee. Maybe it's just 5 people, and those are your key decision makers that can funnel and push back on everybody else and all the other noise that comes in. I think you have to have that, because if a procurement leader himself goes in and says, we're bringing in Zivio, and we're going to bring in this MSP, and they're just going to knock it out, and it's just going to be a real simple solution, piss off a lot of people. So I think you have to have some level of governance. and stakeholders that lead the charge, but it has to be the right level, and it has to be limited to a certain audience. Because when it goes from 5 to 20, and suddenly now you got all these different voices, okay, but those people need to be able to funnel out all that noise and make the decision, because that's where the problems lie. People not making decisions or not knowing who's going to make that decision. So you have your RACI model of who those decision makers on. If you want to have 50 stakeholders, great. These 5 people from your client, from you, Mr. Client, are the ones that are going to make those decisions, and then they need to be accountable to that. So I think there's a way to approach it that can be done in a tactful way, but it can't be in a silo. But it needs to be a nice balance of people across various parts of the organization keen on making a decision and coming to the table with that ability.
Yeah, and it's funny because when I talk to MSPs, sometimes when I kind of broach this area and look at it from this angle of what about a more agile, a faster, a simpler approach to just getting started and moving forward. Quite often there's an initial assumption that this is going to be most applicable to mid-sized customers. But the interesting thing about it is in a lot of cases, this is most applicable to groups, smaller groups within very large organizations, where moving the whole thing is going to be absolutely a nightmare and might never happen for the next 5 years or even longer. But within those big organizations, there are pockets of urgent problems that need to be solved. So it's interesting how it does apply even within those very large customers. But I'm really enjoying this discussion. It's a fascinating conversation. And to be honest, you and I could probably we could probably do quite a few more soapbox moments in this area. I mean,
well, I look forward to meeting up with you in a couple weeks.
Yeah.
Out in Dallas, here in the States.
Yeah, very much looking forward to that. It should be quality. I always enjoy your articles. I love the content you put out. I love the memes that you get into it. You've built a kind of a real thing that you do there, where I know immediately when it's your content, it always gives me a smile. So I'm looking forward to your next article. Yeah, where did that come from?
The memes are fun. I find it as a creative outlet. A lot of it pokes at the industry. I poke at myself in some of them because a lot of things are just not right in the industry. Some of them are just funny, and we all know it. And it's this sort of in any meme, it's just this cultural reference that we understand, and then you tie it into an industry standpoint. It's funny. It becomes a very digestible thing. That's like, oh yeah, that's exactly how it is. So it's fun. Some of them hit, some of them don't, and that's okay. If nothing else, I don't want to be known as just the meme guy and the silly guy. I do provide quality work. I just like to tie it in with a bit of humor and levity as we look at ourselves in the industry, and all we're trying to do is just make things better in the way that work's done. So yeah, thanks. Appreciate you calling that out.
Well, look, it's all part and parcel of delivering content to people, isn't it? There's so much content around. There's great logic and reasoning and research and evidence into what you talk about. Adding some color, some life, and in some cases some humor into it, and sort of self-deprecating humor into it. I think it's great. I really enjoy it, and it's kind of refreshing. I think so. I really appreciate it. But yeah, really looking forward to catching up in Dallas in a few weeks. In terms of obviously this year's kind of, as you say, it's been quite a turbulent year for many reasons. Are there any particular kind of key things that you're going to be focusing on with customers, or focusing on in particular areas as you move through the rest of this year into next year?
Yeah, everybody talks about the future of work. Every company out there has their future of work this, future of work that, and how is it all tying together? To me, it's really just being able, on a case-by-case basis, being able to focus on a client's strategy and goals, what it is they want to accomplish with their contingent workforce, because everybody's maturity roadmap is different, and the maturity model isn't the same for everybody, and there's standardized maturity things out there, but I don't know that those are necessarily real. Gen 1 versus Gen 2, it's, hey, we're just trying to improve the way that we're engaging our non-employee talent. So I think for me, it's continuing to work with clients on helping them realize that, and a lot of it's just validating their thoughts and feelings around how they're doing things, and then helping them modify the approach. So I think another focus is helping companies think differently about freelance work and talent pooling. I think that's a really big space right now that I want to focus on a lot, because it is an innovative and newer approach to getting the talent you need. So I see that continuing to be a body of work that grows for companies. There just requires a lot of education around how that works and how that ties into your current operating rhythm of engaging talent. What's the right way to engage those workers? How do you treat those workers? Because most freelance workers are truly that, freelancers, independent contractors. You need to have very limited control of what they're doing. And when you think of talent pools, those work in different ways of being able to build that repertoire and body of bench of talent that can do repeatable assignments, and then finding out how can you tie that into other bodies of work that you need to complete as well. And that's a whole other conversation. But between that, helping clients mature, and then just continuing to network, talk with people like you, and just learn and talk about and try to solve the problems of the contingent workforce world here.
Yeah, I love it. And you brought up the ideas of kind of flexibility, and what you're talking about is really about moving with the times. But I like the fact that your opening statement on that was it's all about tying it into the company strategy. Amen
What do
to
you
that.
want to do? What's
Yeah.
important to you?
Yeah.
Are you even ready for any of that stuff? Maybe you just need to figure out how to know what your contractors are doing and being able to pay them. That's all right. That's all right. It's all what you're ready for, and you'll get there in time. So it's not a race, it's a journey.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, listen, I really enjoyed this discussion. Thank you so much for coming on and sharing your thoughts. I really found it entertaining and interesting. And yeah, very much looking forward to catching up in a few weeks.
Right on, Johnny. Thank you so much for having me. This was great conversation with you, and looking forward to seeing you in person as well.
Cheers.
Cheers.